Hey guys, tonight we begin with a dinner invitation that nobody wants to accept. Not because the food is terrible, though we'll get to that, but because accepting means playing a game where the rules are invisible, the stakes are your life, and every word you speak could hang you by morning. This is about oath traps, the psychological weapons that 17th century English nobles used to identify traitors among their household staff. It's about how a carefully constructed dinner conversation could force loyal servants to betray conspirators without ever knowing they were doing it. And it's about the one night in 1685 when a steward had to choose between keeping an oath and keeping his life, in real time, across 4 courses of food he couldn't taste. Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about psychological manipulation, about how language can be weaponized, about the hidden power dynamics in formal social situations, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story, if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments what fascinates you most about these historical mind games. I genuinely love knowing who joins me for these explorations of how ordinary social structures become tools of control. Now settle in, perhaps imagine yourself at that table, and let's watch how an oath trap works, step by methodical step. The manor is Ashford House in Somerset, and the year is 1685, which means England is in the middle of the Monmouth Rebellion. The Protestant Duke of Monmouth is trying to overthrow his uncle, the Catholic King James II. The country is choosing sides, and choosing wrong means treason, and treason means hanging or worse. Every great house in England is under suspicion. Every lord is watching his servants for signs of divided loyalty, and every servant is trying desperately to appear neutral, while secretly supporting whichever side they think will win. Richard Holbrook is the head steward at Ashford House, which means he manages everything below stairs, while his employer, Lord William Ashford, manages everything above. Richard is 42 years old, been in service since he was 12, and has the kind of face that reveals absolutely nothing. That's an essential skill for stewards. You see everything, know everything, but show nothing. You're the interface between the lord and the staff, trusted by both, loyal to both, and absolutely screwed if either side decides you've betrayed them.
Richard has a problem. Several problems, actually, but one big one that encompasses all the others. 3 of Ashford House's footmen are secretly supporting Monmouth's rebellion. They're part of a network, passing messages, hiding supplies, possibly even coordinating with rebel forces in the area. Richard knows about this because he's the steward, and stewards know everything. The question is what he does with that knowledge.
He should report them. That's his duty. Lord Ashford is staunchly royalist, vocal in his support of King James, and would want traitors removed from his household immediately. Reporting them would prove Richard's loyalty, protect his position, and possibly earn him a reward. It's the sensible choice.
Except Richard is also secretly sympathetic to Monmouth's cause. Not actively participating, mind you, he's not stupid enough to join a rebellion that will probably fail, but sympathetic, quietly hoping Monmouth succeeds, while taking absolutely no action that could implicate him if Monmouth doesn't. It's the safest position in a dangerous time, neutral enough to survive either outcome. Which means Richard knows about the traitors, is sort of on their side, but can't afford to be associated with them if they're discovered. It's a perfectly balanced position of maximum self-preservation and minimum principle. Richard isn't proud of it, but he's survived in service for 30 years by being realistic about power and self-interest.
Then Lord Ashford calls him to the study, and Richard's careful balance explodes.
Holbrook, Lord Ashford says, without preamble. He's a thin man, 53, with the kind of face that always looks suspicious, even when he's happy. I'm hosting a dinner party tomorrow evening, family and senior staff only. I need you to manage the service.
This should be routine. Richard has managed hundreds of dinner parties, but something about Lord Ashford's tone suggests this isn't routine at all. Of course, my lord. How many guests should I expect?
No guests, just family. My wife, my daughters. And you'll be seated with us.
Richard goes very still. Stewards don't sit with family. They manage service from the sidelines. Being invited to actually sit at the Lord's table is either a tremendous honour or a tremendous trap. Given the current political climate and Lord Ashford's expression, Richard is betting on trap.
My lord, I'm honoured, but— You'll sit, Lord Ashford interrupts, at my right hand. We'll be discussing household loyalty. I want my senior staff present for that conversation. You understand?
Richard understands perfectly. This is an interrogation disguised as dinner. Lord Ashford suspects someone in the household of supporting the rebellion, and he's going to use this meal to identify them. And Richard, as head steward, is going to be the primary witness. He's either going to confirm his loyalty by helping expose the traitors, or he's going to be exposed himself for protecting them.
I understand, my lord, Richard says carefully. Shall I inform the other senior staff?
Just you. The housekeeper and the butler are both new enough that I'm still evaluating their loyalty. You've been with this family for decades. You're the one I trust. Lord Ashford looks at him directly. I do trust you, Holbrook. You've never given me reason not to. Tomorrow evening will confirm that trust remains warranted. It's a threat wrapped in reassurance. Richard is being told that his position is secure as long as he proves his loyalty tomorrow night. And proving his loyalty means betraying the 3 footmen he's been protecting. Or possibly lying to Lord Ashford's face, which is even more dangerous because nobles have been training their whole lives to detect deception in social settings. They're good at it, better than servants expect. Richard returns to his quarters below stairs and thinks very hard about his options. He could warn the footmen, tell them to run, but that would expose him as knowing about their activities, which means he's been covering for them, which is itself treason. He could go to Lord Ashford now and confess everything, claim he just discovered it, but that's an obvious lie, and Lord Ashford isn't stupid. He could show up tomorrow and genuinely not know what to do, let events unfold naturally. But that's not a choice. That's just surrendering control.
What he needs is information. He needs to understand exactly what Lord Ashford is planning, what questions will be asked, what traps will be laid. He needs to know the game before he plays it. Because that's the thing about oath traps. They work by forcing you to choose between breaking a sacred oath and revealing dangerous information. The person who understands the mechanism can sometimes navigate it. The person who doesn't is doomed before they sit down.
Richard spends the evening carefully questioning the other senior staff, fishing for information without revealing why he's asking. He learns that Lord Ashford has been in correspondence with the local magistrate about suspected traitors. He learns that 2 other noble houses in Somerset have recently purged their staffs of rebels. He learns that King James has issued orders encouraging nobles to root out Monmouth supporters by any means necessary, including what they're calling oath examinations.
That phrase catches Richard's attention. Oath examinations. He's heard of them but never seen one in person. They're psychological tactics, ways of using sacred oaths to trap people into revealing information they want to keep hidden. The theory is simple. Most people take oaths seriously, secret, rather than damn their immortal soul.
The execution, though, that's where it gets interesting. Because oath traps aren't just about asking direct questions. They're about creating a social situation where every statement is technically an oath, where silence is suspicious, where the normal rules of polite conversation become a minefield of theological and legal obligations. Done right, an oath trap can extract confessions from people who had no intention of confessing anything.
Richard realizes with cold certainty that tomorrow's dinner is going to be an oath trap. Lord Ashford is going to use the formal structure of the meal, the social obligations of a servant seated with his betters, and the sacred nature of oaths taken at table to force Richard to either expose the traitors or expose himself. And it's going to work, because oath traps are designed by people who spend their entire lives mastering social manipulation against people who spend their entire lives being deferential.
He needs help. Not from anyone at Ashford House. They're all suspects or too junior to be useful. But he knows someone who might understand these tactics. His cousin Margaret works at another house 30 miles away, and she's been in service even longer than Richard. Political turmoil.
Richard writes her a letter that evening, carefully vague in case it's intercepted, but clear enough that Margaret will understand. He sends it by private messenger, pays extra for speed, and prays she'll respond in time. Margaret's reply arrives the next morning, and it's both helpful and terrifying. She's seen oath traps before. She describes how they work in detail, the specific mechanisms, the verbal tricks, the social pressure. She also tells Richard that she's never seen anyone successfully navigate one without either betraying someone or being exposed themselves. Oath traps work because they're designed to have no good options. You either cooperate or you're complicit. But she does offer one piece of advice. Watch the hands, she writes. Not the speaker's hands, the listener's hands. When someone at an oath trap table hears something that threatens them, they do something with their hands. They touch their collar, adjust their cuffs, grip the table edge. It's unconscious. Use that. Watch everyone's hands and you'll know who's guilty before they say a word. It's not much, but it's something. Richard memorizes the letter, burns it, and prepares for the evening ahead. The dinner table is set in the family dining room, smaller than the great hall, more intimate. Lord Ashford is at the head, Lady Ashford to his left, the two daughters on the opposite side. Richard is placed at Lord Ashford's right hand as promised, close enough that their elbows nearly touch, close enough that every whispered word will be heard. The first course is soup. Nobody eats much of it. This isn't about food. The soup is just an excuse to sit here, to create the appearance of normal social dining while conducting psychological warfare underneath. Lord Ashford waits until everyone has been served. Then he raises his glass. Before we begin, let us offer thanks. And let us swear before God that everything said at this table tonight will be truth, that no one here will lie, evade, or withhold information that might protect traitors to the crown. Do you all so swear? It's casual. It sounds like a standard pre-meal blessing, but Richard recognizes it immediately. That's the trap. That's the oath that will bind everything said afterward. Everyone at the table is now sworn before God to speak only truth and to not withhold information about traitors, which means every question Lord Ashford asks is now technically a divine command to answer honestly. I so swear, Lady Ashford says smoothly. She knows what's happening. She's probably in on it. I so swear, the daughters echo, looking confused but obedient. Richard has a split second to decide. Refuse the oath and he's immediately suspicious. Accept it and he's bound to tell the truth about the 3 footmen. There's no good option. That's the whole point of oath traps. I so swear, Richard says, and feels the trap close around him like iron.
Lord Ashford smiles. Excellent. Now, Holbrook, tell me about the household staff. How do you assess their loyalty to me and to the Crown?
And there it is, the first real question. Richard can't lie without breaking his oath, but he can't tell the complete truth without exposing the footmen. He needs to find language that's technically truthful but functionally evasive. It's a tightrope walk across razor wire.
"The staff is loyal to the household, my lord," Richard says carefully. "They perform their duties with dedication and have given me no cause for concern in their service." "That's not what I asked," Lord Ashford says pleasantly. "I asked about their loyalty to me and to the Crown. You've told me they're good at their jobs. I need to know if any of them support the rebellion." Richard's hands want to grip the table edge. He forces them still, remembering Margaret's advice about watching for unconscious gestures. "I have heard no staff member speak in support of the Duke of Monmouth, my lord." That's technically true. Richard has heard them speak carefully around the topic, but never directly in support. It's a lawyer's truth, the kind that satisfies the letter of the oath while violating its spirit. Lord Ashford's face suggests he knows exactly what Richard is doing. "You've heard nothing," Lord Ashford repeats. "You manage 60 people in this household, you oversee every aspect of their lives, and you've heard nothing about the biggest political crisis in England. Do you expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to believe that I am telling you the truth, my lord, as I swore to do." Richard keeps his voice steady, deferential. "The staff are aware that discussing politics is forbidden. They follow that rule in my presence." "In your presence," Lord Ashford says. "What about when you're not present? What do you hear from other staff members about conversations that happen when you're absent?" This is the escalation. Lord Ashford is closing off the escape routes, making the questions more specific, harder to evade. Richard can feel the trap tightening. He glances at Lady Ashford, hoping for some kind of social rescue, but she is watching him with the same evaluating expression as her husband. The daughters are looking increasingly uncomfortable, starting to... "I hear very little second-hand information, my lord. Staff don't typically report private conversations to me unless there's a disciplinary issue." "Then perhaps we should make this a disciplinary issue," Lord Ashford says. He sets down his soup spoon with deliberate care. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, Holbrook, and I remind you that you've sworn before God to answer truthfully. Are there members of this household staff who are actively supporting the Monmouth Rebellion?" There it is, the question Richard has been dreading. Direct, unambiguous, requiring a yes or no answer that will either damn the footman or expose Richard as having protected them. He can't evade this one. The oath trap has sprung completely shut. Richard looks at Lord Ashford's face, then at Lady Ashford's, then at the daughters. They're all watching him, waiting. The silence stretches. Every second he delays makes him look more guilty, but answering will require choosing who to betray. He remembers Margaret's advice. Watch the hands. Richard glances down at his own hands, folded calmly on the table. Then he looks at Lord Ashford's hands, relaxed and confident. Then Lady Ashford's hands, equally composed. Then the daughters. The elder daughter, Catherine, is gripping her napkin tightly, her knuckles white. That's odd. Catherine has no reason to be nervous, unless she knows something, unless she's involved somehow. Richard files that observation away and returns his attention to the impossible question he's been asked. "My lord," Richard says slowly, "I cannot in good conscience answer that question without first clarifying what you mean by actively supporting. If you mean engaging in armed rebellion, then no, absolutely not. If you mean holding sympathetic opinions, then I cannot speak to people's private thoughts, only their actions. If you mean failing to report rumors or suspicions, then... He pauses, choosing his words with surgical care. Then I would say that everyone in this household, myself included, operates in an environment where rumors are plentiful and facts are scarce. I act only on verified information.
It's the best evasion he can manage. It's not a direct answer, but it's not quite a lie either. It suggests that Richard might suspect something, but lacks confirmation, which is both true and completely inadequate.
Lord Ashford leans back in his chair. That's a very careful answer, Holbrook. Some might say suspiciously careful. Let me ask you another way. Have you personally ever overheard any member of my staff express support for Monmouth or criticism of King James?
Now Richard has to lie or confess. There's no middle ground left. The oath trap has eliminated every escape route except truth or perjury. And perjury before God, in front of witnesses, that's not just dangerous to his employment, that's dangerous to his immortal soul, if you believe in that sort of thing, which most people in 1685 absolutely do. Richard makes his choice. Yes, my lord, I have heard 3 footmen discuss the rebellion in sympathetic terms, Robert, James, and Thomas. I was uncertain how to proceed, as their words were ambiguous and could have been idle speculation rather than genuine support. I've been monitoring the situation to gather more definitive evidence before troubling you with uncertain. It's a confession and an excuse simultaneously. He's admitting he knew, but framing it as careful stewardship rather than active concealment. He's throwing the 3 footmen to the wolves while trying to save himself. It's the most self-serving possible interpretation of his obligations, and Lord Ashford knows it.
You've been monitoring, Lord Ashford says softly. How long have you been monitoring, Holbrook?
3 weeks, my lord.
3 weeks, during which you said nothing to me, despite your oath of loyalty to this household, despite your position of responsibility. You said nothing.
I said nothing because I had nothing definitive to report, my lord. Servants speculate about politics constantly. I didn't want to accuse men without solid evidence. How considerate, Lord Ashford says. His voice has gone cold. Tell me, Holbrook, in these 3 weeks of careful monitoring, did you ever tell these footmen to stop their treasonous discussions? Did you ever warn them they were putting themselves in danger? Or did you simply listen and say nothing, protecting your own position while they incriminated themselves further? The accusation is clear. Richard wasn't monitoring, he was covering. He was protecting the footmen, possibly because he shares their sympathies. And his confession just now, that was forced by the oath trap, not volunteered by loyalty. Everything about Richard's behaviour suggests he's compromised.
My lord, Richard says, and he can hear his own career ending in his voice. I have always served this household faithfully. My judgment on this matter may have been flawed, but my loyalty has never wavered. I placed the burden of certainty above the duty of immediate report, and I see now that was an error. I apologize.
Apologies don't restore trust, Lord Ashford says. He stands, which means dinner is over, despite the courses remaining unserved. You're dismissed from service, Holbrook, effective immediately. You leave Ashford House tonight. The 3 footmen you've named will be arrested in the morning. Their trial will determine whether you were incompetent in your judgment or complicit in their treason. I suggest you pray it's the former.
Richard stands mechanically. He's been fired. 30 years of service ended over one dinner conversation he couldn't navigate correctly. The oath trap worked exactly as designed. He was forced to either betray the footman or himself, and he chose the footman. But the betrayal came too late, too reluctantly, with too much obvious hesitation. Lord Ashford sees right through him.
"My lord, please," Richard starts.
"Leave," Lord Ashford says. "Now."
Richard bows, turns and walks out of the dining room with whatever dignity he can salvage. His mind is spinning. The 3 footmen will be arrested. They'll be tried for treason. They'll probably hang. And Richard exposed them to save himself. Except it didn't save him at all. He's still ruined, just differently ruined than if he'd protected them.
Behind him, he hears Lord Ashford speaking quietly to his wife. The words aren't clear, but the tone is. Satisfied, victorious. The oath trap worked perfectly. The guilty parties have been identified. Justice will be served. The household will be purged of traitors.
Richard makes it back to his quarters before the shaking starts. He sits on his narrow bed and stares at his hands, the hands that stayed so carefully controlled at that table while his whole life collapsed, the hands that didn't betray his fear until it was too late to matter.
He thinks about the oath trap, how it worked, how perfectly it was executed. Lord Ashford created a situation where Richard had to choose between breaking a sacred oath and betraying people he'd been protecting. The trap didn't even require clever questions, really, just the structure of sworn testimony at a dinner table. Once Richard swore that initial oath, everything that followed was inevitable. He couldn't lie without damning his soul. He couldn't tell the truth without destroying his position. He was trapped before the soup was served.
That's the genius of oath traps. They use people's own morality against them. If you take oaths seriously, you're vulnerable to them. If you don't take oaths seriously, you're vulnerable to accusations that you're not a proper Christian who fears God's judgment. There's no winning position except somehow never being in the situation where the oath trap can be deployed.
Richard starts packing his belongings. He doesn't have much. 30 years of service, and he owns 1 trunk of possessions. Clothes, a few books, letters from family members who are mostly dead now. That's what a lifetime of servitude gets you. A trunk of belongings and a letter of dismissal that ensures you'll never work in a good house again. He should be angrier, should be raging at the injustice of it, but mostly he just feels tired. He made his choices. He tried to protect people while protecting himself. He thought he could be neutral in a situation that demanded taking sides. The oath trap proved he couldn't. Lord Ashford forced him to choose, and Richard chose badly, and now he's paying for that choice.
The 3 footmen don't know yet. They're probably in the servants' hall right now, eating their dinner, gossiping about the strange family meal happening upstairs. They don't know that Richard has named them, that soldiers will come for them in the morning, that their lives are about to end in a courtroom or on a scaffold. Richard considers warning them. He could slip out, find them, tell them to run. But that would be confirming everything Lord Ashford suspects about him, would be making his situation even worse, if possible. And where would they run to? England in 1685 is small and watched. 3 footmen with no references, no connections, no resources. They'd be caught within days.
Besides, Richard already betrayed them. Warning them now won't undo that, won't give him back his position or his self-respect. He betrayed them to save himself, and it didn't even work. Warning them would just be trying to feel better about a choice that was already made.
So he doesn't warn them. He finishes packing. He writes a brief letter to his cousin Margaret, thanking her for the advice that didn't help, telling her what happened, asking her to remember him kindly. He leaves it on his desk where it will be found eventually. Then he leaves Ashford House in the dark, carrying his trunk, walking down the long drive toward the road. He doesn't look back. There's nothing to look back at. His life was in there, and now it's gone. The oath trap took everything and gave him nothing, except the knowledge that he broke before the main course was even served.
Behind him, the manor house sits in darkness, except for lights in the dining room, where Lord Ashford is probably explaining to his daughters how oath traps work, how to identify traitors, how to maintain power in uncertain times. It's a lesson in practical politics, delivered over an interrupted meal. The girls will remember this night forever. Will remember the steward who couldn't navigate the trap, who exposed himself as sympathetic to treason through his own careful words. Richard walks until he reaches the village, then pays for a room at the inn with his last decent coins. He lies on the lumpy bed and stares at the ceiling and thinks about oaths, about how sacred vows become weapons in clever hands, about how the religious devotion that's supposed to protect your soul can be turned into a trap that destroys your life.
The oath trap worked. Lord Ashford got exactly what he wanted. 3 traitors identified, 1 compromised steward removed, the household purged and secured, all accomplished over a single dinner course with a few well-chosen words and the weight of a sworn oath.
That's the thing about oath traps. They're efficient, devastatingly efficient. They take something people believe in, something sacred and profound, and they weaponize it, turn faith into a liability, turn honesty into a trap, turn the moral obligation to tell the truth into a mechanism for extracting confessions.
And they work. God, do they work. Richard is living proof of how well they work. He's ruined. The footmen are condemned, and Lord Ashford is probably sleeping soundly tonight, knowing his household is secure.
The oath trap at the table worked step by methodical step. First, the oath, innocent sounding but binding. Then the questions, each one narrowing the options, closing the escape routes. Then the final direct question that forced a choice. Then the consequences that followed inevitably from that forced choice. No violence, no torture, no obvious coercion, just dinner conversation and a sworn oath. That's all it took to destroy 4 lives completely.
Richard falls asleep thinking about that, about the elegance and cruelty of it. And in the morning, when soldiers arrive at Ashford House to arrest 3 footmen on charges of treason, he's 10 miles away, walking toward a future he can't imagine, carrying a trunk and the weight of betrayal that the oath trap forced him into.
The oath trap worked. That's the only truth that matters. It worked perfectly, and everyone involved, except Lord Ashford, paid the price. When we left Richard, he was walking away from Ashford House, carrying everything he owned in a trunk, and the knowledge that he'd been completely dismantled by a dinner conversation. The 3 footmen he named don't know yet that soldiers are coming for them. Lord Ashford is probably sleeping soundly, satisfied that his oath trap worked perfectly. Richard is at an inn 10 miles away, staring at a ceiling and wondering how his entire life collapsed between soup and the main course that never got served.
But the story doesn't end there. It can't end there, because oath traps don't just destroy individuals. They create ripples that spread through entire communities. And the trial of Robert, James, and Thomas the footman is about to become a masterclass in how oath traps scale from private dinner conversations to public courtrooms. The arrests happen at dawn, 3 days after Richard's confession. Soldiers arrive at Ashford House with warrants signed by the magistrate. The footmen are dragged from their beds, chained, and thrown into a cart without being told why they're being arrested. The other servants watch in terrified silence, trying to understand what offence these 3 committed that the others didn't.
Everyone at Ashford House has been walking on eggshells since the rebellion started, careful with every word, suspicious of every conversation, and still 3 of them got caught.
The answer is Richard, though the servants don't know that yet. They don't know that their head steward was forced to name traitors at Lord Ashford's table, that he broke under the pressure of a sworn oath and exposed the conspiracy he'd been protecting. All they know is that 3 men they worked beside are suddenly gone, and the magistrate is asking questions about political sympathies, and everyone is terrified they're next.
The trial is scheduled for the following week at the county courthouse in Taunton. It's going to be public, which means it's going to be theatre as much as justice. The Crown wants examples, wants to show what happens to people who support Monmouth. The Monmouth rebellion is failing. Anyone paying attention can see that. But failed rebellions still need to be punished, or the next one comes faster.
Robert, James, and Thomas are being charged with high treason, which carries the death penalty. Specifically, they're charged with conspiring to support armed rebellion against the lawful king, with spreading treasonous sentiments among household staff, and with maintaining correspondence with known rebels. The evidence is Richard's testimony from the oath trap dinner, corroborated by searches of their belongings that turned up absolutely nothing incriminating, which doesn't matter because Richard's sworn statement is sufficient to convict.
That's how oath traps work in legal contexts. If someone has sworn before God to tell the truth, their testimony becomes nearly unimpeachable. The oath itself is the evidence. A sworn statement from a long-time steward naming specific individuals is basically a conviction waiting for formalities. The trial will be quick. The hanging will follow shortly after.
Richard hears about the trial through his cousin Margaret, who sends him a letter expressing sympathy and horror in equal measure. She also sends him a newspaper clipping describing the charges. Richard reads it in his rented room at the inn, and for the first time since leaving Ashford House, he feels something other than numbness. He feels responsible.
He destroyed these men. Not Lord Ashford. Lord Ashford just set the trap. Richard was the one who sprung it. Richard was the one who said the names. Richard's testimony is going to hang them. And while Richard can tell himself he was forced, while he can claim he had no choice, the result is the same. 3 men are going to die because Richard couldn't navigate an oath trap at a dinner table. The guilt eats at him for 3 days. Then he makes a decision that's either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily stupid. He's going to the trial. He's going to testify. He's going to tell the court exactly what happened at that dinner, how the oath trap worked, how he was manipulated into making that confession. He's not sure what good it will do, probably none, but at least he'll have tried. At least he'll have stood up and said, "This isn't justice. This is psychological manipulation dressed up in legal procedure."
He arrives in Taunton the day before the trial and immediately realizes how naive he's being. The town is packed with spectators. The trial isn't about determining guilt. It's about demonstrating power. The Crown versus 3 servants nobody has ever heard of, and the Crown is going to win, because the Crown always wins when it bothers to prosecute. Richard finds a space in the public gallery the morning of the trial and watches as the 3 footmen are brought in. They're in chains. They look exhausted, beaten down, absolutely terrified. They scan the crowd, probably looking for friendly faces, and their eyes pass right over Richard without recognition. He's just another spectator to them. They don't know he's the reason they're here. The prosecution presents its case with brutal efficiency. They enter Richard's sworn statement into evidence. They call Lord Ashford as a witness, who testifies about the oath trap dinner, though of course he doesn't call it that. He describes it as a necessary conversation about household loyalty, conducted with proper religious solemnity, during which his steward made certain troubling revelations about these three servants' political sympathies.
"And what exactly did Mr. Holbrook testify to?" the prosecutor asks.
That he had overheard these three men discussing the rebellion in sympathetic terms, expressing support for the Duke of Monmouth, criticising our lawful King James. These statements were made under sacred oath before God, with full understanding of the obligation to speak truthfully.
Was Mr. Holbrook reluctant to share this information?
Very reluctant, Lord Ashford says, and his tone makes it clear that Richard's reluctance is itself suspicious. I had to press him significantly. He eventually admitted he'd been aware of their treasonous sentiments for 3 weeks, but had failed to report them. His judgment was clearly compromised, which is why I dismissed him from service immediately.
The implication is obvious. Richard was sympathetic to the traitors. His testimony is only credible because he swore an oath that prevented him from protecting them further. If anything, his reluctance proves the 3 footmen are guilty. Why else would Richard hesitate to expose them? The defense attorney, a young man who looks like he wishes he was anywhere else, tries to challenge the credibility of Richard's statement. My lord, we should note that Mr. Holbrook's testimony was obtained under unusual circumstances. He was seated at his employer's dinner table, under social pressure, having just sworn an oath he may not have fully understood the implications of.
Are you suggesting, the judge interrupts, that a sacred oath before God isn't binding, that a man can swear to tell the truth and then be excused from that oath because it was inconvenient?
No, my lord. I'm suggesting that the context in which the oath was given might have influenced.
The context is irrelevant. An oath is an oath. Mr. Holbrook swore before God to tell the truth. He told the truth. That truth implicates these 3 defendants. Unless you're claiming Mr. Holbrook committed perjury, his testimony stands.
The defense attorney sits down. He knows he's lost. There's no defense against a sworn statement, not in 1685, not when the person swearing is a long-time steward with decades of credibility. The oath trap that worked at the dinner table is working just as efficiently in the courtroom.
Richard stands up in the gallery. He doesn't think about it, doesn't plan it, just stands because he can't sit here and watch this anymore.
My lord, he calls out, I'm Richard Holbrook. I need to testify. The courtroom goes silent. The judge looks at him with irritation. This is highly irregular. You've already provided a sworn statement. We don't need your presence here.
With respect, my lord, my statement doesn't reflect the full circumstances. I need to explain how that testimony was obtained.
If you just felt that tension, like watching someone either save himself or destroy himself and not knowing which, that's exactly why I make these videos. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want more of these moments where everything hangs on what someone says next. Because history isn't really about the big dramatic events. It's about ordinary people standing up in courtrooms and deciding that some truths need to be told, even when telling them is dangerous. The judge studies Richard for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he gestures to the witness stand. Very well. Since you're here and since this involves your testimony, you may speak. But understand that if you contradict your sworn statement, you'll be charged with perjury.
Richard walks down from the gallery to the witness stand. His legs feel unsteady. He's about to either save 3 men or hang alongside them, and he's not sure which outcome is more likely. He takes the stand and looks at the 3 footmen. They're watching him now with recognition dawning. Robert's face shows confusion. James looks angry. Thomas just looks resigned.
"State your name for the court," the judge says.
Richard Holbrook, former head steward at Ashford House. And you were present at the dinner where Lord Ashford questioned you about these 3 defendants?
Yes, my lord.
Your statement, already entered into evidence, claims you overheard these men expressing support for the Monmouth Rebellion. Do you stand by that statement?
This is the moment. Richard can confirm his statement, watch the trial proceed to its inevitable conclusion, and walk away clean. Or he can try to explain the oath trap, probably get charged with perjury, and accomplish nothing except ruining himself further.
He chooses the truth, not because it's noble, but because he's already ruined, and might as well go down honestly.
My statement is technically accurate, but deeply misleading, my lord. I was forced into making that confession through what I would call an oath trap. Lord Ashford constructed a social situation specifically designed to extract information I'd been protecting. He began dinner with a general oath that everything said at table would be truthful. Then he asked increasingly specific questions that left me no option except to either break a sacred oath or name the individuals I'd been shielding. I chose to name them, but that choice was made under psychological duress and social coercion that I believe invalidates the voluntary nature of my testimony.
The courtroom erupts in murmuring. The judge bangs his gavel. Silence! Mr. Holbrook, are you claiming you were coerced into telling the truth?
I'm claiming I was manipulated into betraying a confidence using tactics that exploit religious belief for political purposes. The oath trap is designed to force confessions from people by making them choose between breaking their word to God and breaking their loyalty to others. It's psychological manipulation disguised as proper religious procedure.
Do you deny that you swore an oath before God?
No, my lord.
Do you deny that you then testified about treasonous activities?
No, my lord.
Then where's the coercion? You chose to swear the oath. Nobody forced you to attend that dinner. Nobody forced you to answer truthfully. You made choices, Mr. Holbrook, and now you're suffering regret about those choices. That's not coercion. That's consequence.
Richard sees the trap he's walked into. By explaining the oath trap, he's actually reinforcing its legitimacy. The court doesn't see psychological manipulation, they see proper religious procedure that worked exactly as intended. His confession is valid because he swore an oath. The fact that he felt compelled to honor that oath, despite wanting to protect the footmen, just proves the oath's power, which proves his testimony's credibility.
He's made everything worse. Again. My lord, Richard tries one more time. These men don't deserve to hang for political sympathy. They never took up arms. They never actually aided the rebellion. They just talked privately about their beliefs. That's not treason, that's conversation.
Treason, the judge says coldly, is whatever the Crown says it is, and conspiring to support armed rebellion against the lawful king qualifies. Your testimony, Mr. Holbrook, provided the evidence needed to prosecute. Your current attempts to recant that testimony don't change the facts. You told the truth under oath. These 3 men are guilty of the things you testified to, unless you're now claiming you lied when you swore before God. I didn't lie, Richard says quietly. I told the truth I was forced to tell. There's a difference. Not in this court, the judge says. Step down and consider yourself fortunate I'm not charging you with contempt for wasting everyone's time with this performance.
Richard returns to the gallery. The 3 footmen watch him go, and now their expressions are clear. Robert looks betrayed. James looks disgusted. Thomas looks like he pities Richard, which somehow is worse than anger. They understand now. Richard tried to protect them,
got trapped at a dinner table and broke under pressure. Now he's trying to fix it and making everything worse. It's almost tragic, except tragedy requires some kind of dignity, and this is just pathetic.
The trial continues. The defense makes a half-hearted attempt to argue that political sympathy isn't actionable treason, but the prosecutor dismantles that argument in under 5 minutes. The jury deliberates for 20 minutes, mostly as theatre, since the verdict was predetermined the moment Richard's sworn testimony was entered into evidence.
Guilty. All 3 defendants. High treason. Sentence to be pronounced immediately.
The judge doesn't hesitate. Robert Hayes, James Cooper, Thomas Wickham, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out 3 days hence at the public gallows. May God have mercy on your souls.
The 3 footmen are led away. They don't look at Richard as they pass. There's nothing to look at. He's just the mechanism by which they got caught, the weak link that broke when pressed. They probably don't even blame him that much. They knew the risks. They knew supporting Monmouth was dangerous. They just didn't expect to be caught by a dinner conversation that trapped their steward into naming them.
Richard sits in the gallery long after everyone else has left. The courtroom is empty, except for a clerk organising papers. Richard stares at the witness stand, where he just made his pathetic attempt to save 3 lives and only succeeded in cementing their doom.
The oath trap worked in the courtroom exactly like it worked at the dinner table. Once you're sworn to tell the truth, everything you say becomes evidence. Richard's attempt to explain the manipulation just confirmed that the manipulation worked, which validated the testimony it produced. There was never any escape. The trap was perfectly constructed from the beginning.
That night, Richard gets drunk for the first time in his adult life. He finds a tavern near the courthouse and drinks until the world blurs enough to bear. He's surrounded by spectators from the trial, people discussing the verdict, debating whether 3 footmen deserved to hang for talking about politics. Nobody recognizes him as the steward whose testimony convicted them. He's just another drunk in a crowded tavern, anonymous and irrelevant.
Except he's not irrelevant. He's the reason 3 men will hang in 3 days. His words, forced from him by an oath cap he couldn't navigate, are going to kill them, and there's nothing he can do about it. He tried, he testified, he explained the manipulation, and it didn't matter. The system doesn't care about psychological coercion when that coercion produces useful information for the Crown.
2 days before the execution, Richard receives an unexpected visitor at his inn. It's Catherine, Lord Ashford's elder daughter. She's the one whose hands were gripping her napkin tightly during the oath trap dinner, the one whose nervousness Richard noticed but couldn't interpret in the moment.
"Mr. Holbrook," she says, seated stiffly in the inn's common room, "I need to speak with you privately."
They move to Richard's room. It's improper for a noble's daughter to be alone with a former servant, but Catherine clearly doesn't care about propriety right now. She's agitated, frightened, struggling with something she needs to say, but doesn't know how.
"You're going to think I'm terrible," she starts.
"I already think I'm terrible," Richard says. "Whatever you have to say probably won't change my self-assessment."
The oath trap at dinner, my father's questions, they weren't just about the 3 footmen.
Richard waits. Catherine takes a shaking breath. "They were about me. I'm the one who was corresponding with Monmouth supporters. I'm the one passing messages. The 3 footmen were helping me, yes, but I'm the actual traitor my father was looking for. And he knew it was me. The whole dinner, the whole oath trap, That was designed to expose the household support system without having to confront his daughter directly.
Richard feels the world tilt slightly. The oath trap was even more complex than he realized. Lord Ashford wasn't just identifying traitors among servants. He was protecting his daughter by scapegoating the servants who helped her. The 3 footmen are hanging not for their own treason, but for Catherine's, and the oath trap ensured that Richard would name them while never getting close to naming her.
"You noticed my hands," Catherine continues. "At dinner, I saw you look at them. You realized something was wrong, but you didn't say anything. You protected me without even knowing you were doing it."
"I protected you," Richard repeats slowly, "by naming 3 innocent men."
"They're not innocent. They did help me. But their crime is helping me commit treason, not committing it themselves. And they're going to hang while I sit safe in my father's house, because he structured the oath trap to ensure that outcome."
Why are you telling me this? Because I can't live with it, Catherine says. Her voice breaks. I can't let 3 men die for my choices. I'm going to confess. I'm going to tell the magistrate the truth. You were forced into betraying them by my father's manipulation. They were helping me at my request. I'm the actual traitor, and I'm going to take responsibility.
Richard looks at this 19-year-old girl, this privileged daughter of a lord, and sees someone who hasn't yet learned that taking responsibility is much easier to say than to do.
"Your father will disown you," Richard says. "You'll lose everything. Your position, your inheritance, your prospects. They'll probably hang you alongside the footmen if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, they'll make an example of you, because you're nobility, betraying nobility."
"I know," Catherine says. "I know all that. But I can't not do it. I can't let them die while I stay silent. That's not who I want to be."
She's braver than Richard. He realizes that immediately. She's willing to sacrifice everything to save 3 servants, whereas Richard tried to protect himself and only made things worse. She's what Richard should have been at that dinner table, willing to accept the consequences of her choices instead of being trapped into betraying others.
"Wait," Richard says. "Before you confess, let me try something else. One more attempt to dismantle the oath trap before we resort to throwing you into it."
He spends that night writing letters to magistrates, to judges, to anyone in the legal system who might listen. He explains oath traps in detail, describes how they work, argues that confessions extracted through psychological manipulation shouldn't be admissible as evidence. He builds a legal argument that the dinner at Ashford House wasn't proper examination, but coercive interrogation dressed in social nicety.
The letters do nothing. Not one magistrate responds. The legal system doesn't care about his theories regarding psychological manipulation. An oath is an oath. A confession is a confession. 3 footmen are guilty, and they're going to hang. And Richard's scholarly treatises on coercive questioning techniques are simply irrelevant to that reality.
The execution is scheduled for noon, 3 days after the trial. Richard attends because it seems like the least he can do, bearing witness to the deaths his testimony caused. Catherine attends too, veiled and anonymous in the crowd, watching 3 men die for helping her, while she remains safe and undetected.
The hanging is quick, professional. The 3 footmen don't make speeches. Robert looks angry until the end. James is crying. Thomas maintains dignity, standing straight, not giving the crowd the satisfaction of visible fear. The nooses go round their necks. The platform drops. 3 bodies jerk and swing, and eventually go still.
Richard watches it all and feels something fundamental break inside him.
This is what oath traps accomplish. Not just forcing confessions, but creating chains of consequence that end with bodies hanging in public squares. Lord Ashford set the trap. Richard sprung it. The legal system validated it. And 3 men died because they couldn't navigate the combination of psychological manipulation and social coercion that made up that dinner conversation.
Catherine stands beside Richard in the crowd afterward. Neither of them speaks. There's nothing to say. She tried to confess, he tried to recant, and none of it mattered. The oath trap created a truth that became legally binding, regardless of the coercion that produced it. The system worked exactly as designed, identifying traitors and executing them. And if some of the traitors weren't the real ones, and some of the testimony was forced, well, that's just the cost of maintaining order during a rebellion.
"I'm leaving England," Catherine says quietly. "I can't stay here knowing what my father did, what he made you do, what he made me complicit in. I'm going to France. I'll join the Jacobite court in exile. If I'm going to be a traitor anyway, I might as well commit to it properly."
"Your father will hunt you," Richard says.
Probably, but he'll have a harder time executing his daughter in exile than he did executing 3 footmen at home. Distance provides some protection from oath traps. They work best when everyone is trapped at the same table.
She leaves. Richard never sees her again, though he hears years later that she did make it to France, did join the Jacobite cause, and died of fever in 1690, still committed to the rebellion that cost 3 servants their lives. Whether that's redemption or just consistency, Richard never decides. He leaves Taunton that afternoon and spends the next 6 months drifting from town to town, picking up odd work where he can, avoiding questions about his past employment. His letter of dismissal from Lord Ashford ensures he'll never work in a good house again. But there's always work for people with his skills in lesser positions. He works as a clerk, a bookkeeper, even briefly as a school teacher in a village too small to care about references.
But he never forgets the oath trap. Can't forget it. It changed how he thinks about oaths, about truth, about the social machinery that extracts confessions and calls it justice. He becomes obsessed with understanding how they work, how they spread, how they became standard practice in England during periods of political turmoil.
He starts documenting them, collecting stories from other servants, other witnesses, other people who got caught in oath traps and survived or didn't. He writes it all down, creating what amounts to a manual on how oath traps function and how to potentially resist them. It's not a cheerful document. Most of his research concludes that oath traps are basically irresistible if properly constructed. Once you swear the initial oath, you're trapped. The only defense is refusing to swear, which is itself suspicious and socially impossible in most contexts.
But he writes it anyway, partly as therapy, partly as warning, partly as testimony to what happened to him and the 3 footmen who died. Someone should document this, he thinks. Someone should record how oath traps work step by step, how they're deployed at dinner tables and in courtrooms, how they force good people into betraying others, how they turn social obligations and religious devotion into weapons.
His document never gets published. It's too dangerous, too critical of techniques the Crown uses, too likely to make him a target. But he keeps it, adds to it, refines it over the years. By the time he dies in 1702, 17 years after the oath trap dinner that destroyed his life, he's created a thorough analysis of psychological coercion in early modern England.
The document survives him, gets passed down through his family, eventually ends up in an archive, gets discovered by historians centuries later who are stunned by its detail and insight.
Richard Holbrook's manual on oath traps becomes a primary source for understanding how psychological manipulation functioned in 17th century political persecution.
But that's all later. Right now, standing in Taunton, watching the bodies of 3 footmen being cut down from the gallows, Richard is just a former steward who got trapped at a dinner table and said the wrong things to the wrong people at the wrong time. He's living proof that oath traps work, that they're devastatingly effective at extracting confessions and destroying lives, that all it takes is a sacred oath, a few well-chosen questions, and the social pressure to be honest when honesty is deadly.
The oath trap worked step by methodical step. That's what Richard will spend the rest of his life documenting. How each component builds on the last. How the initial oath sets the foundation. How the questions narrow the options. How the social context makes resistance impossible. How the legal system validates confessions extracted through psychological manipulation. How innocent people hang because someone else couldn't navigate a dinner conversation without breaking. That's the machine. That's what oath traps are. Not dramatic torture or obvious coercion. Just careful social engineering, religious obligation, and the weaponization of human decency. You make people want to be honest. Then you make their honesty destroy them and everyone they're trying to protect.
And it works. God does it work. Richard's life is proof. 3 hanging bodies are proof. Lord Ashford sleeping soundly while his daughter flees to France is proof. The whole system is proof that oath traps are maybe the most efficient tool for extracting information that...
Richard walks away from the gallows thinking about all this, and he knows he'll never stop thinking about it. The oath trap at the dinner table worked without night, meaning it took less than 1 evening to completely dismantle his life and condemn 3 men to death, from soup to execution in less than a week. That's the terrifying efficiency of psychological manipulation when wielded by people who've been training in social warfare their entire lives. The trap worked. That's the only truth Richard knows for certain anymore. Everything else is just cataloguing the wreckage. Richard's obsession with documenting oath traps doesn't stop with collecting stories and analysing mechanisms. He becomes something more dangerous than a victim writing about his trauma. He becomes an expert, someone who understands the system so thoroughly that he can teach others how to resist it, or at least how to see it coming before it destroys them. His manual grows from a personal record into a comprehensive guide. He breaks down oath traps into their component parts, identifies the specific psychological principles they exploit, maps out the variations he's encountered in his research. He interviews dozens of people who survived oath traps or watched them destroy others. Servants mostly, but also merchants, minor gentry, anyone who got caught in the web of forced confessions during the political turmoil of the 1680s and 90s. What emerges is a portrait of a social technology that's far more widespread than Richard initially understood. Oath traps aren't rare exceptions used by particularly cruel nobles. They're standard practice. Every great house in England has some version of them. Every period of political uncertainty sees them deployed with increasing frequency. They're tools of social control, methods for identifying dissent before it becomes dangerous, mechanisms for forcing loyalty through the exploitation of religious obligation. Richard learns that Lord Ashford's dinner table oath trap was actually a relatively gentle version. In other houses, the stakes were higher and the consequences more immediate. Some nobles conducted oath traps with soldiers present, ready to arrest anyone who incriminated themselves. Some used oath traps on entire households simultaneously, forcing servants to denounce each other in group settings where solidarity became impossible. Some combined oath traps with actual torture, using the religious obligation to tell truth as justification for physical coercion.
The Monmouth rebellion ends badly, as everyone predicted. Monmouth is captured, tried, and executed. His supporters are hunted down systematically. The bloody assizes, as they come to be known, result in hundreds of executions and thousands of transportations. Judge Jeffreys, who presides over many of these trials, becomes infamous for his use of oath traps to extract confessions and incriminate entire networks of rebels.
Richard watches all this from a safe distance, collecting testimony, documenting methods, and growing increasingly convinced that someone needs to expose how these systems work. Not to stop them. He's realistic enough to know that oath traps are too useful to the powerful to ever be abandoned, but at least to make people aware they exist, to give the powerless some understanding of the mechanisms being used against them.
He writes about the step-by-step process, how it begins with establishing the oath itself, usually framed as routine religious practice. Nobody refuses to swear before God without looking suspicious, so the initial oath is nearly impossible to avoid. That's step one, the foundation that makes everything else possible.
Step 2 is the narrowing questions. Start broad, give the victim room to evade, then gradually make the questions more specific. Close off escape routes one by one until there's nowhere left to hide. This is where the skill of the interrogator matters. The clumsy noble might ask direct questions too early, allowing the victim to deflect or refuse. A skilled operator like Lord Ashford constructs the narrowing so gradually that the victim doesn't realize they're being trapped until it's too late.
Step 3 is the direct question that forces the choice. By this point, all the evasions have been eliminated. The victim has to either break their oath or reveal the information being sought. This is the moment of maximum psychological pressure. The weight of religious obligation, social expectation, and immediate consequence, all bearing down simultaneously. Most people break. That's not weakness, that's human nature under extreme stress.
Step 4 is the aftermath, when the confession is formalized and made legally binding. This is where the oath trap transitions from private coercion to public prosecution. The confession extracted under psychological duress becomes sworn testimony that can hang people. The victim is transformed from target into witness, implicated in the prosecution while remaining vulnerable to charges of complicity for having protected traitors in the first place.
Richard documents all of this meticulously. He creates diagrams showing how the steps flow into each other. He collects examples of actual questions asked during oath traps, showing the patterns and techniques that work most effectively. He even develops theoretical defenses, though most of them are impractical. Refuse the initial oath, get arrested for suspicious behavior, answer questions ambiguously, get pressed until the ambiguity collapses, lie under oath, risk your immortal soul, and still probably get caught, because nobles are trained to detect deception.
The only real defense, Richard concludes, is to never be in a position where an oath trap can be deployed against you, which means never being valuable enough to interrogate, never knowing anything worth extracting, never being trusted with secrets that could incriminate others. It means deliberate ignorance as survival strategy, staying stupid so you can't be forced to betray anyone.
That's a terrible conclusion. It means the oath trap's real effect isn't just extracting confessions, but making everyone afraid to know anything, creating a society where information itself becomes toxic because possessing it makes you vulnerable. The oath trap doesn't just catch traitors, it destroys the possibility of trust and shared confidence among the lower classes. Everyone becomes isolated, suspicious,
unable to coordinate resistance, because coordination requires shared knowledge, and shared knowledge makes you a target for oath traps. Richard is documenting the destruction of solidarity. That's what his manual ultimately records. Not just how oath traps work, but how they fragment communities by making mutual trust dangerous. He sends a copy of his developing manuscript to his cousin Margaret, hoping she might add her own observations. Margaret is still working as a housekeeper at a different manor, still surviving through careful attention to power dynamics, still watching other people get trapped by systems she barely escapes. Her response is lengthy and brutal. She confirms everything Richard has documented and adds her own examples. She also tells him something he hasn't fully processed, that women experience oath traps differently than men. For male servants, oath traps usually operate through formal dinner settings or official interrogations. For women, oath traps happen in private chambers, often one-on-one, frequently with an additional layer of sexual coercion. A lady questioning her housemaid about suspected treason isn't just deploying religious obligation. She's also using the complete power differential between mistress and servant, the threat of dismissal without references, and sometimes the threat of sexual scandal, regardless of truth. Margaret has seen housemaids destroyed by accusations of impropriety when they refused to participate in oath traps. Women who wouldn't name names suddenly found themselves accused of theft or adultery or witchcraft, whatever charge was convenient, and their careers ended not through legal conviction but through reputation damage. It's an additional weapon that makes oath traps even more inescapable for women in service. Richard adds this to his manuscript. His manual is becoming darker with every edition, painting a picture of a society where psychological manipulation is completely normalized, where extracting confessions through coercion is just how things work, where the powerful have developed sophisticated tools for controlling information flow and maintaining dominance. By 1695, 10 years after the oath trap dinner that destroyed his career, Richard has created a document that's simultaneously historical record, psychological analysis, and resistance manual. It's dangerous. He knows it's dangerous. Publishing it would probably get him arrested for sedition or worse, but he keeps refining it, adding to it, hoping that someday someone will be able to use this knowledge to resist the traps that caught him. He never publishes it during his lifetime. It's too risky. Instead, he makes copies, handwritten, and distributes them carefully through the servant network, other stewards, other housekeepers, people who manage households and need to understand the mechanisms being used to control them. The manual circulates quietly through below-stairs England, passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied, gradually becoming part of the shared knowledge of people who live under constant surveillance and periodic purges. Some of them find the manual helpful, learn to recognize the signs of an approaching oath trap, develop strategies for protecting themselves, careful ignorance, strategic amnesia, the art of knowing nothing that could be extracted. Some find it depressing, confirmation that they're trapped in systems with no real resistance possible. Some use it to refine their own manipulation tactics, because knowledge of how control works can be used by anyone, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Richard never knows which category most readers fall into. He just keeps writing, documenting, analyzing, hoping that information itself is resistance, even if it doesn't prevent the traps from working. In 1698, 13 years after the dinner at Ashford House, Richard receives unexpected correspondence. It's from Lord Ashford, forwarded through several intermediaries to Richard's current location. The letter is brief and surprisingly direct.
Mr. Holbrook, I understand you've been documenting what you call oath traps.
I've seen your manuscript through channels you probably didn't intend me to access. I want you to know that you've accurately described the mechanisms, but you've fundamentally misunderstood the purpose. Oath traps aren't tools of oppression. They're tools of order. They prevent conspiracies from festering. They identify threats before they become dangerous. They maintain social stability during periods when stability is precarious. You focus on the individuals caught in them without considering the broader benefit to society. 3 footmen hanged to prevent a rebellion from gaining household support throughout England. That's a reasonable exchange. Your career ruined to protect the realm from Jacobite infiltration. Also reasonable. I don't expect you to agree, but I want you to understand that what you see as cruelty is actually necessity. Order requires mechanisms for maintaining itself. Oath traps are one such mechanism, efficient, effective, and entirely defensible from a position of responsibility for social stability.
Richard reads this letter multiple times. Lord Ashford is right, in a way. From the perspective of someone responsible for maintaining order, oath traps make perfect sense. They're efficient tools for identifying threats and extracting information. The fact that they destroy individual lives is just an acceptable cost of keeping society stable.
But Richard disagrees with the fundamental premise. The problem isn't that oath traps are inefficient. The problem is that they're too efficient. They're so good at extracting confessions that they extract confessions from people who aren't really guilty of anything except talking. They're so powerful at identifying threats that they see threats everywhere. They maintain order by making everyone so afraid of being questioned that nobody dares think independently.
That's not order, that's paralysis. That's a society where the mechanisms of control have become more important than the things supposedly being controlled.
Richard writes back to Lord Ashford. His response is longer, more detailed, arguing that oath traps don't prevent conspiracies so much as drive them underground, where they become more dangerous. That forcing confessions doesn't reveal actual traitors so much as it reveals who has the psychological resilience to resist manipulation. That the 3 footmen who hanged weren't the real threat. Catherine was the real threat, and she escaped because the oath trap caught the wrong people.
He never receives a response to this letter. Lord Ashford probably read it, considered it, and dismissed it as the complaints of someone who got caught and is now trying to justify their failure. Or maybe Lord Ashford understood Richard's points and simply didn't care, because oath traps work well enough for the people who deploy them. The failures are other people's problems.
Richard continues his documentation, continues his research, continues his obsessive analysis of the mechanisms that destroyed his life and killed 3 men. It becomes his life's work in a way he never intended. He's not a scholar or a writer. He's a former steward with no credentials and no platform. But he's also the world's foremost expert on oath traps, having both experienced them and studied them more thoroughly than probably anyone else in England.
Thank you for spending this time with me exploring how oath traps worked and what they revealed about power and control in early modern England. If this story changed how you think about psychological manipulation, about the weaponization of religious belief, about how social structures become tools of oppression, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your thoughts. What surprised you most about how these mechanisms worked? Where do you see similar psychological traps operating today? What does this tell us about the relationship between order and freedom? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your reflections on these questions of coercion, conscience, and the cost of maintaining control.
In 1702, Richard dies in a boarding house in Bristol. He's 59 years old, never remarried after his first wife died years earlier, never had children, never returned to service in any great house. His landlady finds him sitting at his desk, pen still in hand, working on yet another addition to his manuscript about oath traps. The last entry he wrote before his heart gave out describes a new variation he'd heard about from a correspondent in Yorkshire. His manuscript, by now hundreds of pages accumulated over 17 years, is found among his belongings. The landlady, unable to read and unaware of its contents, sells it to a bookseller for a few coins. The bookseller reads enough to realize it's dangerous and interesting in equal measure. He makes several copies, sells them to collectors who appreciate forbidden knowledge, and eventually the manuscript enters the underground circulation of political dissidents and reform-minded intellectuals.
By 1715, Richard's manual on oath traps is being read in coffee houses by people who are starting to question whether psychological coercion should be acceptable in legal proceedings. By 1730, lawyers are citing it in arguments about the admissibility of confessions extracted under duress. By 1750, it's influenced thinking about individual rights, forced testimony, and the limits of state power to compel statements.
Richard never knows any of this. He died thinking his work was a failure, a record of victimhood rather than a tool for resistance. But his obsessive documentation of how oath traps work step by step becomes foundational to later legal reforms that limit coercive questioning, protect against self-incrimination, and establish the principle that confessions must be voluntary to be valid. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, protecting against compelled self-incrimination, has intellectual roots that trace back partly to Richard Holbrook's manual. The principle that you cannot be forced to testify against yourself, that oath traps are illegitimate regardless of their efficiency, that psychological coercion invalidates consent. These are ideas Richard helped articulate through his detailed analysis of the mechanisms that destroyed him.
But that's all later, all consequence he never sees. Right now, in the stories present of the 1680s and 90s, oath traps are just standard practice. They're how the powerful maintain control. They're tools deployed at dinner tables and in courtrooms and in private chambers throughout England, and they work.
The habits they created persisted long after the specific political crisis of the Monmouth Rebellion ended. Servants learned to be carefully ignorant. Nobody wanted to know things that could be extracted from them. Trust became more difficult because sharing information made everyone vulnerable. The social fabric frayed as oath traps made coordination and solidarity dangerous.
And the threats changed. Not just the immediate threat of being trapped yourself, but the ambient threat that created chronic anxiety. Anyone could be called to testify. Any dinner could become an interrogation. Any casual oath could transform into a binding obligation to betray people you cared about. The threat was omnipresent and largely invisible until it activated.
That's what oath traps ultimately accomplished. They didn't just catch specific traitors. They created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and self-censoring that made organized resistance nearly impossible. They weaponized the very things that should create social bonds, shared meals, religious observance, community trust, and turned them into mechanisms of control.
Lord Ashford was right that oath traps maintained order, but it was the order of silence and fear, not genuine stability. It was everyone being too afraid to speak, to know, to coordinate. That's not a healthy society. That's a paralyzed one. Richard understood this by the end. His later writings in the manual become more philosophical, less focused on mechanisms, and more concerned with the social cost of these control systems. He argues that oath traps are effective in the short term, but corrosive in the long term. They destroy the possibility of trust. They make communities brittle. They ensure that when control finally breaks,
and it always eventually breaks, the collapse is more catastrophic because all the social bonds that might absorb shock have been eroded by years of forced mutual betrayal. He's writing about England in the 1680s, but he is describing a universal pattern. Any society that relies on psychological coercion and forced confession eventually pays the price in damaged social cohesion. The oath trap works step by methodical step to extract information and maintain control. But it also works step by methodical step to destroy the foundation of mutual trust that makes societies function.
That's the real story of oath traps. Not just how they work, that's mechanical, documented, learnable, but what they cost, what they take from communities, what they do to people who experience them, and people who watch them, and people who learn they exist and have to live with that knowledge.
Richard lived with that knowledge for 17 years after his dinner with Lord Ashford, lived with understanding exactly how he was manipulated, lived with remembering the face of 3 men hanging because he couldn't resist that manipulation, lived with the guilt and the analysis and the obsessive documentation of a system that's still operating, still trapping people, still forcing betrayals.
He died sitting at his desk, trying to understand one more variation of the trap that destroyed him. That's dedication or obsession, or possibly just the inability to move past trauma. But it's also the work that needed doing. Someone had to document this. Someone had to explain step by step how oath traps function. Someone had to create a record that later generations could use to resist or reform, or at least understand what was being done to them.
Richard was that someone. By accident, by trauma, by 17 years of obsessive analysis, he became the expert on the mechanism that destroyed him. And in becoming that expert, he created knowledge that eventually helped dismantle similar mechanisms in other times and places. That's cold comfort for Richard, who never knew about his influence, but it's something. In the long arc of history, his dinner with Lord Ashford, his broken testimony in court, his ruined career and his 17 years of documentation, all of it mattered. Not in ways Richard saw or benefited from, but in ways that changed how societies think about coercion, confession, and the limits of power. The oath trap at the dinner table worked step by methodical step without night, meaning it took less than an evening to completely spring. But the consequences rippled outward for decades. 3 footmen hanged, 1 steward ruined and obsessed, 1 noble daughter fled to exile, 1 father sleeping soundly, having successfully protected his daughter by sacrificing servants, and 1 manuscript circulating quietly through England's underclass, teaching people to recognize the mechanisms of their own oppression. All from 1 dinner, 1 oath, 1 series of carefully constructed questions that left no room for evasion. That's the power of oath traps. That's what they accomplish. Not just immediate confessions, but long-term paralysis. Not just extracted information, but damaged communities.
And that's what Richard's manual documents. The full scope of what oath traps do, how they work mechanically, how they function socially, how they spread fear, how they corrode trust, how they maintain order through the destruction of the very bonds that make ordered society possible. It's a comprehensive analysis of a control mechanism that was so effective it nearly destroyed the possibility of resistance. Nearly, but not quite. Because Richard's documentation exists, because people read it and learned from it, because the knowledge of how traps work is itself a kind of resistance, even if it doesn't prevent the traps from functioning, because understanding oppression is the first step toward limiting it.
Richard never saw that first step turn into actual reform, but he took it. He did the work of documentation and analysis that makes later resistance possible. He turned his trauma into something useful. He made his failure matter by refusing to let it be forgotten.
That's what the story of oath traps ultimately teaches. Not just how they function, but how to remember that they function. How to preserve knowledge of mechanisms of control so that future generations can resist or reform them. How individual suffering, properly documented and analyzed, becomes collective wisdom.
The oath trap worked, but so did Richard's response to that trap. The working happened on different timescales, with different consequences, but both shaped history. Both changed how societies function. The trap's efficiency and Richard's obsessive documentation exist together in the historical record, showing us both how control works and how resistance to control begins.
That's the legacy. Not victory, not defeat, but knowledge. Painful, hard-won, carefully preserved knowledge about power and manipulation and the psychological mechanisms that let the powerful control the powerless. Richard paid for that knowledge with his career, his peace of mind, and his remaining years. But he preserved it, made it available, turned his personal destruction into public education.
The oath trap forced Richard to name traitors at a table. Richard forced later generations to name the trap itself, to see it, to understand it, to know that when someone makes you swear an oath before asking you questions, you're walking into a mechanism designed to extract information against your will. That knowledge doesn't prevent the trap from working, but it changes how people experience it, changes how they prepare for it, changes how they resist it where resistance is possible. Richard Holbrook died in 1702 believing he'd failed. He'd been trapped, broken, ruined. 3 men had died because of his forced testimony. His career was destroyed. His life was reduced to obsessive documentation of his own victimization. By any personal measure, he'd lost.
But by historical measure, he won something. Not everything, not even most things, but something. He created a record that survived him, that influenced thought and law and social practice, that made later resistance possible, that turned one dinner conversation into a cautionary tale about the weaponization of religious belief and social obligation. The oath trap at Ashford House in 1685 worked step by methodical step without night, less than an evening to destroy 4 lives completely. But the understanding Richard built from that destruction has endured for centuries, has shaped how we think about coercion and consent and the limits of power, has influenced legal protections that billions of people now enjoy.
Was it worth it? That's not a question Richard could answer. 3 men hanged, 1 man's life consumed by trauma and obsession, 1 woman exiled, 1 powerful man completely validated in his use of psychological manipulation. Against all that, put increased understanding of coercive mechanisms and modest legal reforms centuries later.
The math doesn't work out neatly. There's no clean balance. The oath trap's efficiency and cruelty sit alongside Richard's documentation and analysis, both real, both consequential, both shaping how societies control and resist control.
That's history. Not neat, not just, not even always meaningful, but documented, preserved, passed down through manuscripts like Richard's, through stories like this one, through the accumulated knowledge of how traps work and how people survive or don't survive them. The oath trap forced stewards to name traitors at table, step by step, without night, with terrible efficiency.
and Richard Holbrook spent 17 years explaining exactly how it worked, creating knowledge that outlived him, mattered more than he knew, and changed things in ways he never saw.
That has to be enough, because it's all there is. The trap worked. The response worked differently. Both shaped the world. Both matter to understanding how power operates and how resistance begins.
And that's the story of oath traps and Richard Holbrook and the dinner that destroyed 4 lives while creating knowledge that protected millions. Of mechanisms that work too well and documentation that works slowly but permanently. Of trauma turned into analysis and analysis preserved for centuries.
The oath trap at the table worked, and Richard's manual about that trap also worked. Different victories, different timescales, both real, both shaping how we understand coercion, conscience, and the terrible efficiency of psychological manipulation when wielded by people who've mastered the art of social control.
That's what oath traps taught England in the 1680s, and that's what Richard Holbrook taught everyone who came after. The price of that education was steep, but the knowledge endures, and that's worth something. Maybe not everything, but something worth preserving, worth remembering, worth passing down through stories that explain step by step how these mechanisms worked and what they cost the people trapped